indiscriminate attacks and the requirements of proportionality. All hospitals able to receive injured civilians were damaged or destroyed, including the child care departments of Mariupol Hospital No. 3. By the end of March, the damage and destruction coupled with the lack of electricity and medical supplies meant that hospitals had effectively ceased to function. Electricity, gas, and water supplies in Mariupol were cut in early March, while it was still icily cold outside. People spent days and nights in cold basements and apartments. Older people and persons with disabilities were often confined to their apartments. Many were killed by shelling, while others burned or were suffocated in fires which could not be extinguished due to a lack of available fire services. Due to a shortage of drinking water, people took long, dangerous trips to wells or open reservoirs to procure such water as could be found. Others were forced to melt snow or to drink water extracted from cars or other equipment. The centralized sewage system ceased to function. Not only were food supplies scarce, but people had to go outside during ongoing fighting and under shelling to cook on open fires. Despite our attempts at verifying, it is not clear to what extent the parties to the conflict comply with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Civilian survivors share varying accounts, but most reported that military positions were often placed in the immediate proximity of civilians and civilian objects. Attacks on those positions were common practice. The harm to civilians was extensive. More than 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been taken as prisoners of war from Mariupol since early March. My office received allegations of the killing of a Ukrainian soldier or the combat in Mariupol and ill treatment of several others. In the absence of access to prisoners of war in territory controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, my office has not been able to assess their conditions of detention and treatment. OHCHR is also concerned with alleged trials of 3 Ukrainian service persons who are also 3 third-country nationals who were taken as prisoners of war in Mariupol. They were convicted of the attempted seizure of power in territory controlled by Russian-affiliated armed groups in Donetsk, training for terrorist activities and mercenarism, and sentenced to death. I recall the prohibition against prosecuting prisoners of war for conducting substance amounting to lawful participation in hostilities. I have additional concerns that fair trial guarantees were not complied with, including that the defendant in these cases were not able to present a full defense. The so-called courts in this area have long failed to comply with international standards, including the general right to a public hearing, the principles of independence and impartiality, and the right not to be compelled to testify against oneself. The deprivation of the right of prisoners of war to a fair and regular trial is prohibited under international law and may amount to a war of crime. Distinguished President, Excellencies, the current situation is dire. The shelling has now faded, but a shattered and depleted city is left, with its remaining residents struggling daily with limited access to basic utilities and social services such as medical care. Risks of infectious disease, including cholera, are being reported. Many people either no longer have a place to live or live in damaged apartments, often with no windows, electricity, gas, and running water. Many people are heavily dependent on humanitarian aid from Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups and do not have means to sustain a livelihood. People cannot leave and return to the city freely, including those who left Mariupol in April or March. I'm also concerned about the way the so-called filtration process of civilians was and is being carried out, but reportedly involving arbitrary terminations, intimidation, and humiliation, which may amount to ill treatment, as well as reported instances of family separation and threats to the right to private life. The related risk of detentions and ill treatment for those who do not pass the process are also of concern. Finally, the removal of explosive remnants of war from the city and recovery, identification, and decent burial of all mortal remains must be immediately prioritized. The Russian Federation must uphold all of its obligations under applicable international law as the occupying power in Mariupol. In addition to guarantee our monitoring is independent and impartial, our human rights teams must have complete and unimpeded access to Mariupol and all other affected areas in Ukraine, as well as effective access to relevant information. The tragedy of Mariupol is far from over. and the full picture of the devastation caused is not yet clear. The city can eventually be rebuilt, but the horrors inflicted on the civilian population will leave their indelible mark, including on generations to come, on the parents who had to bury their own children, on people who witnessed their friends commit suicide, on families ripped apart, on all those who had to leave a much-loved city with uncertain prospect of ever seeing it again. Pursuing justice and ensuring remedy and reparation for all victims are crucial next steps for all authorities with power to so act, and for international actors, including my own office. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, alta comisionada. Empezaremos por escuchar a las delegaciones de los países interesados. Tiene la palabra la delegación de la Federación Rusa.
Благодарю вас. Госпожа Верховный комиссар, в связи с вашим докладом, прежде всего, хочу подчеркнуть, что город Мариуполь полностью освобожден от украинских нацистских формирований. Этот город 8 лет фактически находился в заложниках у нацистов Азова, и теперь туда возвращается покой и налаживается мирная жизнь. Власти ДНР обеспечивают возобновление вода- и электроснабжения жилых домов, работы общественного транспорта. Так что мы вообще не видим смысла в сегодняшнем заседании. События пошли совершенно по другому сценарию. 8 лет конфликта в Донбассе Европа и США цинично нахваливали Киев за его некие демократические успехи, вместо того, чтобы указывать ему на уничтожение гражданского населения на юго-востоке страны, на разгул неонацизма, на гонение на национальные, религиозные и языковые меньшинства. Именно потакание новому нацистскому режиму в Европе и отсутствие политической воли по выполнению Киевом взятых на себя в рамках Минских соглашений обязательств и привели к нынешнему кризису на Украине. Теперь же страны НАТО и ЕС, накачивающие киевский режим вооружениями и подталкивающие его к продолжению боевых действий, разыгрывают на площадке Совета по правам человека очередной политико-пропагандистский фарс. ВСУ не прекращают терроризировать мирное население ЛНР и ДНР, нанося удары по жилому сектору, населенным пунктам и гражданским объектам с применением реактивных систем залпового огня массового поражения. На протяжении мая и июня наблюдается усиление обстрелов украинскими вооруженными формированиями жилых районов Донбасса, которые стали ежедневными. Фиксируется по 50-70 обстрелов в день. Каждый такой обстрел уносит жизни простых людей. Разрушены или повреждены десятки объектов гражданской инфраструктуры, включая больницы, школы и детские сады. В результате массированных обстрелов ВСУ Донецка пострадал центр города, роддом, рынки. Мирные жители вынуждены прятаться в убежищах. С 5 июня украинские вооруженные формирования ежедневно ведут огонь по жилым кварталам Стаханова. Только 9 июня по городу было выпущено 20 снарядов, погибло 13 мирных жителей, еще 6 ранены. В результате ракетного удара 30 мая по Свято-Успенской Святогорской лавре погибли 3 священнослужителей, ранены 3 гражданских лица. 4 июня обстрел ВСУ вызвал масштабный пожар на территории лавры, пламя которого полностью уничтожило главный храм обители. В распоряжении правоохранительных органов России и ДНР попадают все новые свидетельства преступных действий в Мариуполе. Прицельной стрельбе украинских боевиков по жилым кварталам, использование населения в качестве живого щита, насилие над мирными жителями, оборудование военных огневых точек в домах мирных жителей, школах, в больницах и социальных учреждениях. Российская сторона неоднократно доводила до вашего сведения, уважаемый Верховный комиссар, и возглавляемого вами управления факты и свидетельства нарушений со стороны украинских вооруженных формирований и нацбатов норм международного гуманитарного права, включая блокирование ВСУ гуманитарных коридоров для эвакуации населения из зон боевых действий или насильственное удержание боевиками Азова на протяжении 2,5 месяцев местных жителей в заминированных цехах завода «Азовсталь». Но обо всем этом вы, уважаемый Верховный комиссар, да и в целом делегаты западных стран, так же, как и западные лживые СМИ, стыдливо предпочитают умалчивать. Вынуждены констатировать, что управление таким образом становится проводником геополитических интересов коллективного Запада, демонстрируя отход от принципов беспристрастности и объективности в своей деятельности. Хотим напомнить, что все люди равны в своих правах, и права и жизни жителей ДНР и ЛНР тоже имеют значение. Благодарю вас.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la distinguida delegación de Ucrania. Está llegando la embajadora. Embajadora, es un video de una autoridad desde Ucrania, perdón. Tiene la palabra. Obviamente estamos tratando de resolver el tema técnico. Un momento, por favor, tratándose de un país interesado, vamos a decidir cómo hacer su presentación. Sí. Pedimos disculpas en nombre de la Secretaría y de la Presidencia por un problema técnico. Entonces, para no retrasar, vamos a comenzar la lista de oradores y cuando estemos en condiciones vamos a incorporar la presentación de las autoridades de Ucrania. Por lo tanto, comenzamos la lista de oradores y le doy la palabra a Su Excelencia la señora Ann-Kristin Linde, ministra de Asuntos Exteriores de Suecia, en nombre de un grupo de países, por video. Esperemos que este funcione. Evidentemente parecería que es un tema del reseteo del sistema de videos, como nos ha pasado en otras ocasiones. Si les parece, haríamos la lista de las delegaciones que están en persona en sala y cuando se solucione el sistema volvemos a los videos. Entonces le doy la palabra a la distinguida embajadora de la Unión Europea. La escuchamos.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union would like to thank the High Commissioner for her update. The European Union is gravely concerned about the catastrophic human rights and humanitarian situation in Mariupol. Estimates of civilian casualties are horrifying. The population is suffering. In the current situation, not even the most basic needs are met. We demand Russia to immediately ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access and delivery of aid, and allow the safe and voluntary passage of civilians in the direction they wish, as also indicated by the European Court of Human Rights in March of this year. Moreover, we are alarmed about the reports of deportations of Ukrainian citizens, including children from Mariupol to Russia, prohibited under international law. We urge Russia to fully respect the rights and the dignity of the prisoners of war and treat them in accordance with the requirements of international humanitarian law. We also condemn Russia's attempts to set up illegitimate alternative administrative structures in Mariupol. Such steps are in violation of international law and the Ukrainian constitution. The EU is steadfast in its support to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We reiterate our call on Russia to fully comply with its obligations under international law. We call on Russia to end its war of aggression against Ukraine and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Estonia.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, Estonia fully aligns with the statement delivered by the European Union and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. Mariupol symbolizes the brutality of Russia's assault and the stubbornness of Ukraine's resistance. Visually, the city of Mariupol now resembles those European cities that were turned into ruins during World War II. The international community lacks information on the fate of a large part of the city's residents. There are no reliable figures on how many of them, mainly women and children, have been deported to Russia or to Russian occupied territories. There are no data on how many people are in filtration camps or in prison. There are no numbers on how many people have been killed. People who managed to escape from the city have told terrible stories. Those responsible for war crimes committed by the aggressor state in Mariupol must be brought to justice. Estonia fully supports the investigation by the ICC and other initiatives, including the Commission of Inquiry. There is an urgent need to ensure immediate, unrestricted and secure access for international investigators. Last but not least, the soldiers of the Ukrainian army who defended Mariupol and surrendered and are now in imprisonment must be treated in accordance with international humanitarian law and must be handed over to Ukraine through the exchange of prisoners. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame la Haute Commissaire, la France salue la tenue de ce dialogue et vous remercie pour votre présentation qui atteste de la situation humanitaire insoutenable résultant de l'agression illégale et injustifiable lancée par la Russie contre l'Ukraine. À Marioupol, les bombardements incessants de l'armée russe ont détruit la quasi-totalité de la ville, frappant et tuant de manière indiscriminée les forces militaires ukrainiennes comme les populations non combattantes et les infrastructures civiles en violation du droit international humanitaire. Chaque jour, le nombre des victimes augmente et des informations faisant état d'exactions insoutenables sont rapportées. La France condamne dans les termes les plus vifs ces atrocités. Elle soutient le déploiement rapide de mécanismes permettant que leurs auteurs ne restent pas impunis, y compris la commission d'enquête indépendante sur l'Ukraine de la Cour pénale internationale. Le passage volontaire, sûr et sans entrave des populations civiles qui doivent quitter la ville dans la direction de leur choix est essentiel, ainsi que l'accès des organisations humanitaires aux populations civiles, aux prisonniers et aux prisonniers de guerre qui doivent être traités conformément au droit international humanitaire. La population de Marioupol souffre, car dans la situation actuelle, même les besoins les plus élémentaires ne sont pas satisfaits en raison du manque d'eau, d'électricité ou de médicaments. Elle continue à faire preuve d'un courage exemplaire. Nous nous tenons aux côtés de l'Ukraine et de son peuple. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Noruega.
Thank you. Mr. President, Norway thanks the High Commissioner for her report, which confirms the terrible human rights situation in Mariupol. Norway is appalled by the scale of destruction in the city. The Russian aggression has caused unknown numbers of deaths and injuries. Their use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas causes great harm to civilians. There are credible reports of unlawful killings, including summary executions, and Russia has refused evacuation of civilians to territory controlled by the Ukrainian government. Many have reportedly been forcibly displaced to Russia or areas controlled by Russian forces. Civilians must be allowed to return safely to territory controlled by Ukraine. In all areas occupied by Russian forces, there are shocking reports of enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, torture, and conflict-related sexual violence. Russia must stop its violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Ukraine. It must stop its aggression and withdraw its forces from Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Ecuador.
Señor Presidente, mi delegación agradece a la alta comisionada por su actualización oral sobre la grave situación humanitaria y derechos humanos en Mariupol. El Ecuador reitera su profunda preocupación por el deterioro de la situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania a causa de la agresión militar perpetrada por Rusia. Mi país está consternado por la situación en Mariupol y por la magnitud de la destrucción y las violaciones del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y derecho internacional humanitario, incluidos ataques contra la población civil, infraestructura civil, escuelas y hospitales, así como uso de la tortura, desapariciones forzadas y ejecuciones extrajudiciales. Ecuador condena dichas violaciones y toda amenaza o uso de la fuerza contra la integridad territorial de los estados y reitera su firme llamado para que Rusia ponga fin a la incursión militar en Ucrania y se produzca el cese inmediato de las hostilidades. Además, reitera la necesidad de que se efectúen investigaciones exhaustivas y se procese a los responsables en las instancias competentes, así como que se garantice a las víctimas el pleno acceso a justicia y reparación. Mi delegación destaca el papel de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada en la evaluación objetiva de la situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania y apoya el trabajo de la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Alemania.
Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. Madam High Commissioner, we thank you for your oral update. The images of Mariupol went around the world. They are exemplary for the brutal war Russia has waged against its peaceful neighboring country, Ukraine. They are exemplary for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law and human suffering that is hard to bear. The city was almost entirely destroyed by Russian shelling, with civilians, men, women and children as victims. Vis-à-vis those gross violations of human rights, the international community must not look away, but speak up against Putin's brutal war. Mariupol also stands like few other places for the implications for the whole world, for all of us. The 3-month siege of the port city has devastating effect on the already tense situation of global food security. The sea blockade has left millions of tons of grain to be shipped to the entire world inaccessible. This concerns all of us. And again, we must speak up, stand up. Let's not look away. Let's name those responsible for creating suffering with Ukraine and exacerbating the global food shortage. We once again condemn the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We stand in solidarity with Ukraine and its people and the people of Mariupol. Madam High Commissioner, how can the international community ensure access to the city of Mariupol for international observers, the human rights monitoring mission and accountability mechanisms? Thank you.
Danke. Tiene la palabra Islandia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Iceland thanks the High Commissioner for her briefing on the devastating situation in Mariupol. What we have heard today has unfortunately become a common threat in Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine. The report of atrocities committed by the Russian military in Ukraine are shocking. Blatant disregard of human lives is a signature of Russia's warfare for the past months. The Russian military continues to flagrantly violate the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law by way of executions, sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary detentions, enforced displacements, and shelling of hospitals and schools. This is something we have unfortunately seen in multiple cities across Ukraine, including Mariupol and Bucha. We must continue to collectively fight against impunity for violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Those responsible for committing those atrocities against civilians must be brought to justice. Iceland fully supports the Commission of Inquiry and other initiatives to this end, including the investigation of the ICC. Iceland also commends the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and other states in their joint efforts, along with the ICC, to facilitate investigations and prosecutions in the concerned state, as well as those that could be taken forward before the ICC. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Lituania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Lithuania thanks the High Commissioner for the oral update and aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. After heavy bombardments by the Russian forces and deaths of thousands of civilians that ruined the city of Mariupol, and it became a symbol of brave and courageous Ukrainian people defending their right to exist as a nation and as an independent sovereign state. Mariupol, its residents, have suffered from targeted killings and executions, sexual and gender-based violence, torture, forced deportations, and, in case of children, the illegal adoption in Russia. The international community must seek full accountability for all human rights and international humanitarian law violations, war crimes, bloodshed of thousands of innocent people of Mariupol, including women and children, committed by Russia. Moreover, we strongly condemn any attempt by Russia to replace democratically elected and legitimate administration and to set up illegitimate alternative administrative structures in Mariupol. Such steps are in violation of international law and of Ukraine's constitution. They undermine sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and will not be recognized. Madam High Commissioner, war prisoners from Mariupol, mostly from Azovstal steel plant, who surrendered and were taken to Russia, now are tortured, ill-treated and facing proceedings there, and how to protect their human rights. Thank you.
Gracias. Me informan que se ha solucionado el problema técnico, por lo tanto, retomamos el orden y comenzamos con la intervención de las autoridades de Ucrania. Ahora sí. Muchas gracias.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, more than 100 days have now passed since Russia has launched its unlawful and unjustified war against Ukraine, shocking the world with its brutal and horrifying disregard for human rights. The city of Mariupol, the place where I was born and raised in, experienced the worst horror of this war and become destined to forever stand as a monument of everlasting spirit of the Ukrainian people and the unspeakable severity of the Russian aggression. The almost 3 months Mariupol has heroically resisted Moscow assault and bloody destruction under constant shelling and bombs. The world was decimated by the cruelty of attacks on the maternity ward and the trauma theater. There are hundreds of children, women, and most vulnerable were seeking refuge, but were forever buried under the rubble. According to the most modest estimates, at least 22,000 civilians have been killed by the Russians in the course of their besiegement on the city. Another 47,000 have been forcibly transferred to Russia or other occupied territories. The city of 500,000 inhabitants was torn into ashes, with 1,300 buildings and countless objects of civilian infrastructure destroyed. There should be no escape to impunity for these crimes, and we call on the international community to work with us on ensuring accountability. We also plead not to forget about those more than 100,000 of our citizens who today remain hostages in Mariupol under the Russian occupation. The life in the city has turned into survival. People continue to live in basements due to the complete destruction of their homes by Russian artillery and bombs. The day of an ordinary Mariupol resident starts with a line: for water, for food, for medical help and medication. Since April, at least 16,000 Mariupol residents have been buried by the Russian invaders in the mass graves, the villages of Stary Krim, Mangush, Vinogradne. Thousands more still remain under the rubble of the destroyed buildings. The Russians are destroying the evidence. Its corpses remain in the debris. They are dumped along with garbage at the landfill. Inhuman treatment, even of the dead, is unspeakable. Experts warn of the possible outbreak of extremely dangerous infections, diseases in Russian-occupied Mariupol. Cholera, dysentery, and other diseases could kill at least 10,000 of residents by the end of the year. Mariupol is purposefully turned into a ghetto for the Ukrainians, where the genocide takes place at an accelerated pace. Ruined lives, ravaged homes, the loss of loved ones, the endless smell of death. This is the face of the Russian world that come to Mariupol. The story of Mariupol would be incomplete without mentioning the Ukrainian defenders who for 3 months protected the city from the Russian invaders. Their courage, endurance, and determination have become an example of immeasurable heroism, which will go down in history of military mastery and of Ukrainian resistance. Almost 2,500 of them are now being held by Russia as prisoners of war. We call on the international community to join us in demanding that Moscow implements its obligations under international humanitarian law and engages with all relevant parties and international mechanisms to ensure their return home and safety and dignity. It was not for this war. Earlier this week, the residents of Mariupol would have celebrated the 8th anniversary of the first liberation of the city from Russian occupation. This city, my city, will forever remain an integral part of Ukraine, and we will not rest until our people they are freed again as they were at 2014. It is a matter of principle and a moral duty for the international community to help us in ensuring that this day comes soon. The justice for Ukrainian Mariupol is restored and that the fundamental principle of international law and human rights prevail. I thank you.
Thank you. Y ahora vamos a volver a la lista de oradores que no pudieron expresarse. Comenzamos con Suecia. Su Excelencia, la señora Ann-Kristin Linde, ministra de Asuntos Extranjeros de Suecia, en nombre de un grupo de países. Tiene la palabra.
Mr. President, on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries, I thank the High Commissioner for her crucial briefing on the devastating situation in Mariupol, a city I visited a year ago, passing the theater, now in ruins, where so many lost their lives. The abhorrent violation of human rights and international humanitarian law committed in Mariupol, including arbitrary detentions, executions, sexual and gender-based violence, shelling of hospitals and the enforced displacement are no exceptions in Russia's warfare, rather the opposite. This calls for continued and increased efforts to pressure Russia to end its aggression. We demand that Russia adheres to international law, including provisions of international humanitarian law relating to the protection of prisoners of war. Russia must immediately allow the safe return of Ukrainian civilians forcibly removed to Russia. Those responsible must be held account. The investigation by the ICC and other initiatives to this end, including the Commission of Inquiry, have our full support. The violations committed by Russia in Ukraine cannot be undone, but Russia can decide not to extend the list of victims. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra ahora Su Excelencia, la señora Maggie Fino, viceministra para Europa y de Asuntos Extranjeros de Albania, en nombre de un grupo de países. Tiene la palabra.
President, I am pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the 46 member states in Geneva of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. We thank the High Commissioner for her update and welcome this important opportunity to discuss Russia's ongoing military aggression against Ukraine. It is a discussion that concerns us all, as Russia's military aggression against Ukraine violates the UN Charter and international law, which underpin peaceful coexistence and global security. Safeguarding this rests on our collective ability to ensure accountability for perpetrators and justice for victims in Mariupol and elsewhere. We urge Russia to abide by its obligations under international law confirmed by the legally binding ICJ order of 16th of March 2022. We remain horrified by continued reports of indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, forced deportations of children, followed by threat of illegal adoption, rape, and other sexual and gender-based violence in Ukraine. We call on all parties to strictly respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law and seek individual accountability. We're furthermore deeply concerned about the grave effects of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine on global food security and energy systems. Developing countries and persons in vulnerable situations are particularly affected. The Group of Friends welcomes the many initiatives to collect evidence and investigate crimes committed during the Russian military aggression against Ukraine, including those by the Commission of Inquiry and the ICC, as well as the valuable support of the Office of the High Commissioner to these endeavors. We encourage all involved actors to strengthen coordination to ensure effectiveness and to avoid re-traumatization of victims. Civil society actors continue to have an important role in documenting violations and abuses. We stand in full solidarity with Ukraine and its courageous people. Madam High Commissioner, how can we best pursue accountability when access to Mariupol and other regions under temporary Russian control in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine are restricted by Russia, and given the alleged deportation of people from Ukraine to Russia, including victims and witnesses? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Liechtenstein por video.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein wants to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her oral update on the human rights situation in Mariupol in Ukraine. Liechtenstein is appalled by the Russian military's relentless attacks across Ukraine, which found a particularly violent expression in the shelling and bombing of Mariupol. The near-total destruction of civilian infrastructure in Mariupol continues to have a devastating impact on the lives of millions of people. Schools, hospitals, and other vital infrastructure have been mercilessly destroyed, and today the city allegedly faces an increasing amount of cholera cases due to the lack of health care as well as water and sanitation. The Russian aggressor's warfare is a grave violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. These crimes must not go unpunished, and perpetrators must be brought to justice. In this context, we strongly support the ongoing investigations by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Russia should abide by the ICJ's interim ruling and immediately cease all military operations in Ukraine. Liechtenstein looks forward to providing substantial support to Ukraine in its reconstruction efforts and stresses the need for all parties to this contract to uphold respect for international law. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Eslovenia y luego cerramos la lista de oradores. Eslovenia por video.
Mr. President, Slovenia would like to thank the High Commissioner for her update. Slovenia remains gravely concerned over the news coming from Mariupol. Reports we have been receiving in the last months on the developments in the besieged city, the civilian suffering and deaths that go into thousands are horrifying. We are appalled by the growing evidence of atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces. Reports of sexual violence against women and girls, but also men and boys, are increasing. International community needs to increase its support for international and national investigations and help close the impunity gap and ensure accountability for these horrific crimes. Slovenia sees the urgent need for adoption of the Convention on International Cooperation in the Investigation and Prosecution of the Crime of Genocide, Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes, known also as the MLA Initiative. The adoption of the Convention would substantially enhance capacities of states for domestic prosecution of atrocity crimes, aiming to end impunity for their perpetrators. We reiterate our call on Russia to cease its use of force against Ukraine immediately, and we continue to support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
Thank you. Ahora continuamos con nuestra lista de oradores y le doy la palabra al distinguido embajador de Japón. Tiene la palabra.
Gracias, señor presidente. Japan expressed its concern about the human rights and the humanitarian situation in Mariupol and the rest of Ukraine, as the High Commissioner stated before. We are also concerned by the growing number of civilians killed and injured as a result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The killing of innocent civilians is a grave breach of international humanitarian law and absolutely unacceptable. This cannot be allowed to continue. Japan condemns Russia's aggressions against Ukraine in the strongest terms. Japan hopes that the COI established by the Council under Resolution 49-1 will continue to conduct its work to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law in Ukraine, as I set out in the Commission's mandate. Japan will continue to do its utmost to stop the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine in collaboration with the international community. I thank you.
Arigato. Tiene la palabra la Suisse.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse condamne avec la plus grande fermeté l'agression militaire de la Fédération de Russie contre l'Ukraine, qui a entraîné entre autres la destruction de la ville de Mariupol et fait de très nombreuses victimes civiles. L'attaque contre la maternité et l'hôpital pour enfants de Mariupol le 9 mars, ainsi que le bombardement du théâtre de Mariupol le 16 mars, qui servait d'abri aux civils, constituent Selon le rapport du mécanisme d'enquête de l'OSCE, des exemples de violations graves du droit international humanitaire de la part de la Russie. La Suisse s'engage pour que les auteurs de tels crimes soient tenus de rendre des comptes. Elle appelle au respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme en toutes circonstances et par toutes les parties. La situation humanitaire à Mariupol reste très préoccupante et pourrait être aggravée en raison des risques d'épidémie. La Suisse appelle la Russie comme puissance occupante à œuvrer rapidement à l'amélioration de la situation humanitaire à Mariupol et à protéger les personnes sur place conformément à ses obligations internationales. Afin de mettre fin aux violations graves du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme, la Russie doit cesser les opérations de combat et se retirer complètement d'Ukraine. Monsieur le Président, combien de personnes qui ont dû fuir Mariupol sont internées par les forces russes et quel est l'accès à ces personnes par les acteurs internationaux? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Luxembourg. Ambassadeur.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration présentée par l'Union européenne et remercie la haute-commissaire pour son compte-rendu oral. La situation à Mariupol est devenue pendant ces derniers mois le symbole des monstrueuses méthodes qu'emploie la Russie dans sa guerre injustifiable et illégale contre l'Ukraine. Les bombardements ciblés et à large échelle d'infrastructures civiles, le refus d'accès aux acteurs humanitaires, le recours aux armes incendiaires et non discriminatoires avec un nombre indicible de victimes civiles comme moyen d'exercer la pression sur l'adversaire ne sont pas les seules atrocités constatées lors du siège de la ville. S'y ont ajouté, dès l'occupation complète par l'envahisseur russe, des rapports de violation continue des droits humains des habitants de la ville, y compris la violation des droits de réunion et d'association, la non-poursuite de centaines de cas de meurtres, de tortures et de violences sexuelles, ainsi que la déportation de citoyens ukrainiens, hommes, femmes et enfants en Russie. Cette pratique strictement interdite en droit international et en droit international humanitaire constitue un crime de guerre et pourrait correspondre à bien d'autres définitions encore. La Russie doit, jusqu'au moment de la restitution à l'Ukraine de tous les territoires illégalement occupés et du retrait de toutes les forces russes du pays, pleinement respecter ses obligations en droit international et en termes de droits humains. Les violations de ces droits par la Russie ne sauront en aucun cas être ignorées ni rester impunies. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra la República Checa.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Madam High Commissioner, thank you for your oral update. Mariupol is, with no doubt, one of the main tragic symbols of the brutal and senseless war that Russia wages against Ukraine. The city of 500,000 people has lived with a war in its backyard since 2014. The hardship, however, has never stopped Mariupolitans from striving for a better future. Step by step, with help of the people from all over the world, they move their city forward, reconstructing hospitals and universities, building up parks, developing businesses. All this, buildings, lives and dreams, are now destroyed by Russian bombs. Human rights have become meaningless in the city under constant shelling, with no running water, limited food supplies and lack of medicine. Tens of thousands of people were deprived of the very core right to life. The others have to make a choice: surviving in destroyed city in dire conditions, or living through so-called filtration camps, where the rule of law or human dignity are non-existing. What happened to families hiding in the theater of Mariupol, clearly marked as a place of child shelter? Who made the decision to bomb hospitals, thus committing a clear war crime? Where are the people who do not pass the filtration procedure when trying to escape the city? Russia hides answers. Russia wages the war which creates the environment where human lives and rights mean nothing. We call on Russia to immediately stop the war, and we ask all relevant international bodies to ensure justice for victims of these horrors. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la embajadora de España.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España agradece a la alta comisionada su actualización oral sobre la situación en Mariupol y se alinea con la declaración de la Unión Europea. España vuelve a condenar en los términos más enérgicos la agresión rusa a Ucrania y exige que la Federación Rusa cese sus acciones militares de forma inmediata e incondicional y retire todas sus tropas y armamento de la totalidad del territorio ucraniano, incluyendo de la ilegalmente anexionada península de Crimea. Mariupol ha sufrido un terrible asedio en el que se han documentado numerosos casos de muertes indiscriminadas de civiles y violencia sexual contra mujeres y niñas, siendo hospitales, colegios y áreas residenciales objeto de ataques. Los civiles que intentaban huir encontraron obstáculos para su evacuación, siendo algunos de ellos trasladados contra su voluntad a Rusia o a territorios bajo control ruso. La destrucción a la que se ha visto sometida la ciudad constituye un ejemplo de graves violaciones de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario, siendo los colectivos más vulnerables los que sufren con particular intensidad las consecuencias. Ninguna violación de los derechos humanos debe quedar impune. Confiamos en que la Comisión de Investigación Independiente, al igual que su propia oficina, puedan documentar las posibles violaciones del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario y llevar a cabo las investigaciones necesarias para contribuir a que los responsables de estas violaciones rindan cuentas de sus actos. España otorga gran importancia a la coordinación entre los mecanismos internacionales establecidos para garantizar justicia y reparación a las víctimas. Señora Alta Comisionada, ¿cómo se podría establecer y asegurar una eficaz coordinación entre todos estos mecanismos? Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Canadá.
Mr. President, Canada extends its thanks to the High Commissioner for her update on the situation in Mariupol as a result of Russia's unjustifiable and brutal invasion. The cruelty, atrocities, and devastation caused by Russian forces in Ukraine are beyond comprehension. The city of Mariupol has endured some of the worst suffering, with more than 20,000 civilians feared dead, and the city almost completely destroyed. For more than 3 months, residents remain trapped, sheltering in basements and in the Azovstal steel plant as shells and airstrikes landed around them. Russian forces block civilian access to food, water, electricity, and communications. Civilians endured torture, rape, forced deportations, and executions. It is critical that we continue to document these grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law for future accountability. We are also deeply concerned about the current global food crisis and its impact on vulnerable populations around the globe, especially in Africa and in the Middle East. We call on Russia to allow Ukrainian farmers to once again feed the world. Madam High Commissioner, as there are several accountability efforts underway with respect to the situation in Ukraine, including the investigation by the ICC, can you clarify how the OHCHR is coordinating its work with other mechanisms? Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Paraguay.
Gracias, señor presidente. Paraguay agradece la presentación de esta actualización oral y sigue con profundo pesar los sucesos que están ocurriendo en Mariupol. Mi país se solidariza con las víctimas civiles que al día de hoy deben afrontar las consecuencias de esta situación. Antes de la guerra vivían cerca de 500.000 de personas en esta ciudad y se desconoce cuántos civiles se encuentran ahí y aquellos que se quedaron, debiendo enfrentarse al alarmante deterioro de las condiciones sanitarias y higiénicas y al temor de brotes de todo tipo de enfermedades infecciosas. Condenamos enérgicamente las violaciones de derechos humanos cometidas en contra de la población civil, en especial a poblaciones vulnerables. Nos alarman las crecientes acusaciones de todo tipo de violencia contra mujeres, niños y niñas y reafirmamos la importancia de garantizar a las víctimas el acceso a servicios de apoyo adecuado. Señor presidente, exigimos a las partes el estricto respeto del derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y que se tomen todas las medidas necesarias para proteger a la población civil. Finalmente, el Paraguay insta a las partes a redoblar esfuerzos para encontrar una solución diplomática y duradera en cumplimiento de los principios y obligaciones emanadas de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Montenegro.
Thank the High Commissioner for the update.
We are appalled by the unspeakable horrors and the scale of destruction of the besieged Mariupol, almost reduced to ashes, by weeks of shelling and massacre by the Russian armed forces. This was done without mercy for civilian lives and infrastructure, in blatant violation of basic tenets of international law and the IHL. The remaining population is deprived of basic human needs, without access to fresh water, sanitation and medicines. Reports of an outbreak of infectious diseases in the city testify to the hopelessness of the remaining citizens and to the callous disrespect of the Russian army for human lives and dignity. The deportation and forcible displacement of the population to non-government control areas of Ukraine as well as to Russia are unacceptable and contrary to international humanitarian law and may constitute a war crime. As said, Mariupol has already become a synonym for horrific crimes of Russian aggression, and we must do everything we can to make it a synonym for justice. The work of the ICC, Commission of Inquiry, and other investigating mechanisms to collect and preserve evidence remains crucial for fighting impunity and serving justice, as it is the work of the HRMM in Ukraine. Those responsible for the atrocities, crimes throughout Ukraine must be held accountable. Montenegro stands in solidarity with the brave Ukrainian people and will continue to provide humanitarian and other means to help the country resist the aggressor and defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra. No hay sonido en el video. ¿Podemos ponerlo desde el comienzo, por favor?
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela reitera su preocupación por el agravamiento del conflicto en Ucrania. Seguimos de cerca los acontecimientos en el terreno, resultado de años de violaciones de los derechos humanos en la región del Donbass, con una dolorosa pérdida de vidas, cuya génesis ha sido el quebrantamiento de los acuerdos de Minsk, producto de la instigación del gobierno de Estados Unidos. La expansión permanente de la OTAN hacia el este de Europa y la creciente hostilidad contra Rusia, al menos desde el año 2014, añadieron amenazas insoslayables. Los países de la OTAN han armado Ucrania en una perversa y peligrosa maniobra que crea un precedente y que prolongará el conflicto con consecuencias inimaginables. Rechazamos, por supuesto, las medidas coercitivas unilaterales impuestas a la Federación de Rusia que intensifican el conflicto y menoscaban los derechos humanos tanto de su pueblo como en los países que promueven esas mal llamadas sanciones. Señor presidente, la prioridad de este Consejo es crear las condiciones necesarias para propiciar el cese del conflicto. Mi país, que es defensor de los principios y propósitos de la Carta de la ONU, alienta a retomar el camino del entendimiento diplomático mediante el diálogo entre las partes en aras de preservar la vida, los derechos humanos y la necesaria estabilidad en la región. Una vez más, apelamos a nuestra diplomacia bolivariana de paz, llamando a cesar toda acción que conduzca a una escalada. Solo a través del diálogo político y la contención sin presiones ni sanciones podremos avanzar hacia la resolución pacífica del conflicto y garantizar el pleno respeto, promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Australia.
Thank you. Russia has committed egregious war crimes in Mariupol and other cities across Ukraine. Russia's siege has led to unspeakable suffering for innocent civilians. Attacks on a maternity hospital and theatre have killed over 300. The list of atrocities grows daily. We are appalled by increasing reports of acts of sexual violence against women and girls by Russian forces in Ukraine. Deliberately targeting innocent civilians is a war crime. Australia condemns these acts in the strongest possible terms. Russia's invasion is directly contributing to global food insecurity and compounding the devastating impacts of COVID, conflict and climate on fragile food systems. We must hold Russia to account. That is why Australia strongly supports the work of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. It is why the Council requested the High Commissioner to provide an update on Mariupol today. We welcome the ongoing work of the Office and its Ukraine monitoring mission. We again call on Russia to cease its unprovoked, unjustified and illegal invasion of Ukraine and immediately withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory. We reiterate Australia's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Latvia aligns with the EU statement.
Madam High Commissioner, we thank you for the oral update. Since the start of the Russian invasion, the city of Mariupol and its residents have experienced countless atrocities. The human rights and humanitarian situation in Mariupol is catastrophic. The city is in ruins after weeks of shelling and deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. The death toll is estimated in tens of thousands. The remaining residents are facing a food, water and health crisis. Russian occupying forces continue to deny safe and voluntary passage to civilians in whichever direction they wish. There are continued reports of forced deportations to the territory of Russia, a clear violation of international humanitarian law. We strongly condemn any attempts by Russia to replace democratically elected and legitimate governing bodies and to set up illegitimate alternative administrative structures in Mariupol. The international community must not fail the people of Mariupol. We must hold all those responsible for these atrocities accountable. Latvia fully supports the ICC investigation, the Commission of Inquiry set up by this Council, and all other relevant accountability mechanisms. In conclusion, Latvia condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military invasion of Ukraine and affirms its unwavering support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra República de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia's military aggression against Ukraine enters into its fourth month with no end in sight. The Republic of Korea remains deeply concerned over the unspeakable plight of civilians caused by Russia's military campaign. In particular, this conflict has left a devastating impact on the city of Mariupol after Russia's several weeks of siege and indiscriminate shelling. Reportedly, there have been thousands of civilian casualties and widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, including a maternity hospital and a drama theater, where a number of civilians were sheltering. We strongly condemn such atrocities and stress that all violations of international human rights and humanitarian law must be thoroughly investigated to ensure accountability. In this regard, we fully support the work of Commission of Inquiry and the UN monitoring mission in Ukraine. Another major concern is the worsening humanitarian situation in Mariupol. We are gravely concerned about the lack of basic services and necessities for the remaining residents, as well as a potential cholera outbreak in the city. In light of this, safe and unfettered humanitarian access must be guaranteed. Finally, against this troubling backdrop, my delegation calls on Russia to put an immediate end to its military aggression and to fully respect the sovereignty, political independence, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Grecia.
Greece aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her presentation. Eastern Ukraine has been hit the hardest by the Russian invading forces. Mariupol, home to a centuries-old Greek community, has been almost entirely destroyed. We are alarmed about the reports of deportations of Ukrainian citizens, including many persons belonging to minorities, from Mariupol to Russia. In this regard, we fully support the investigation of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the work of the Independent Commission of Inquiry. Greece has asked the prosecutor of the ICC to conduct an investigation on the crimes committed in Mariupol and in the villages of Sartana and Volnovaka. Greece has so far delivered multiple packages of needs-based in-kind humanitarian assistance for the suffering Ukrainian people. The Greek Minister for Foreign Affairs has personally delivered part of this humanitarian aid during his visit to Odessa last April. The deplorable invasion of Ukraine is a stark reminder that revisionism remains a serious and ever-present threat. A clear line has been drawn between those that shun international law, seeking to impose the revisionist agenda on their neighbors by force, and those that are both committed to and willing to defend the rules-based international order. Madam High Commissioner, We would welcome any relevant updates on the situation of human rights of ethnic minorities in Mariupol. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Rumania.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, Romania aligned itself with the EU statement. We warmly thank the High Commissioner and her office for the update, which unfortunately confirms only partially so far to what extent the human rights violations and humanitarian situation aggravated before and during the brutal siege of Mariupol. The city was constantly targeted since 2014 by Russia, resisted heroically, and remains a symbol. We cannot but recognize and commend the courage, resilience, and power of sacrifice of Ukrainian forces that held out for as long as they could in horrifying conditions. The apocalyptic image of the city now occupied by Russian forces will stay in Ukrainians and the whole world's memory for a while, marked by deep grief for so many and totally useless loss of lives, heart pain, and immense casualties. The international community should not allow that all the sacrifice made and the enduring potential of strength remain in vain. This unlawful war and attacks against civilians and civilian facilities must end. It has disastrous humanitarian, economic, social, and global security consequences. We should work so that all these atrocities that may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide committed in Mariupol and throughout Ukrainian territory do not go unpunished. All efforts should be made in order to ensure independent and effective investigation so that all those responsible are held to account and victims are given the needed assistance and reparations. Romania is playing its part and supports actively the efforts of the international community to investigate these violations of international law, human rights, and international humanitarian law. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Italia, Ambasciatore.
Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. We are deeply concerned by the human rights situation and the humanitarian catastrophe in Mariupol and are horrified by continued reports of indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, forced deportation, in particular of children, sexual and gender-based violence. We renew our call on Russia to put an end to a war that continues to cause tragic suffering and a loss of life. We remain committed to support all measures to ensure the accountability of those who are responsible for the atrocities perpetrated in Mariupol and all over Ukraine. We also urge Russia to fully comply with international humanitarian law, allowing safe and unhindered humanitarian access, as well as the humanitarian evacuation of civilians in the direction they wish. The impact of Russian military aggression against Ukraine on global food security and energy systems is becoming increasingly alarming, and Italy is actively promoting initiatives to assist developing countries and persons in vulnerable situations. Italy will continue to stand with the Ukrainian government and people during this crisis, placing particular attention on the civilian population's growing humanitarian needs. In conclusion, I reiterate our support for the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. I thank you. Gracias.
Grazie, Ambasciatore. Tiene la palabra Moldova.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, a city of almost 500,000 has been wiped out after endless airstrikes by the Russian military. Your update includes 1,348 confirmed deaths in Mariupol, among them 70 children. How many men, women, children actually died from the Russian siege? Only time will tell. But numbers are soulless, numbers obliterate the people and personalities behind, and they don't even begin to cover the tragedy of each and every one who fell or fled or lost someone dear. The atrocities committed in Mariupol are bone-chilling with mass burial areas across the city, and allegations of spreading cholera and other diseases only confirm how dire the situation is while posing a huge threat of deadly outbreaks. Around 100,000 people remain in the Russian-occupied Mariupol with minimum access to healthcare, water or basic services. We urge the Russian Federation to free Mariupol and withdraw its forces from the ground to allow humanitarian aid and medical care. To conclude, I would like to uphold our strong support for the comprehensive and independent investigations conducted by the Commission of Inquiry. We reiterate our commitment to accountability for the appalling violations and abuses against the people of Mariupol, including forced transfer of population, torture and other criminal and inhuman treatments, arbitrary execution, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances. We continue to stand by the brave people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Denmark.
Mr. President, Denmark aligns itself with the EU statement. Denmark stands in full solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. We reiterate our condemnation in the full and strongest possible terms of Russia's blatant act of aggression against Ukraine. In the wake of this act of aggression, we continue to see heartbreaking images of adults and children being injured and killed, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. We must send a clear signal. Those responsible for these acts will be held accountable. To this end, we strongly support all investigations into possible crimes against humanity, as well as violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and human rights during the war in Mariupol and across Ukraine, including those by the International Criminal Court and the Independent Commission of Inquiry, amongst others. Finally, Madam High Commissioner, what more can the Human Rights Council do to ensure that human rights violations and abuses committed in the wake of Russian aggression against Ukraine are investigated and the perpetrators held to account? Thank you.
Thank you. Tem a palavra a delegação de Portugal.
With the EU statement. Madam High Commissioner, we thank you for your update, which paints an alarming picture of the situation in Mariupol. Mariupol was once a flourishing city, it now lies in ruins. Since Russia's aggression against Ukraine started, the residents of Mariupol suffered unthinkable horrors. While the scale of the atrocities is not yet completely known, reports of civilian casualties rise to the tens of thousands, and we all have seen footage of attacks against schools, hospitals, residential communities and other civilian infrastructure. Human rights violations, including acts that may amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity, must be fully investigated, and we need to keep working to collect and preserve all evidence available. We call on Russia to immediately terminate all hostilities in Ukraine. IHL must also be fully respected and humanitarian corridors be preserved. Portugal salutes the UN, the efforts of the Secretary General and ICRC for their efforts on evacuations and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Portugal stands ready to keep welcoming all those fleeing from the conflict in Ukraine, and we shall keep ensuring that the 38,000 Ukrainians already in Portugal have their human rights fulfilled without discrimination. I thank you.
Muito obrigado. Tiene la palabra Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to the High Commissioner for her update. On the 16th of March, 3 months ago to the day, the International Court of Justice ordered Russia to immediately suspend military operations in Ukraine. And yet, Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal attack upon Ukraine continues, as do the atrocities committed by Russian troops throughout Ukraine. For more than 100 days, we are seeing Russia's calculated onslaught bear down on the people of Ukraine. And while no one really knows the true extent of casualties, we know that the actual figures are considerably higher than what the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has been able to verify. And we know that unless Russia ends this war, the horrors visited on the people of Ukraine will reach far beyond Ukraine. Mariupol, the formerly bustling city, now razed to the ground, has been turned into a crime scene. Indiscriminate shelling, enforced disappearances and killings of civilians, starvation, sexual violence, attacks on humanitarian corridors, unlawful detention and torture. The scale of atrocities in Ukraine grows as Russia's vicious campaign of annihilation continues. The chilling message Mariupol sends is not for other cities of Ukraine alone, but for all who are committed to the international rules-based order. It is our collective duty to ensure accountability for the perpetrators and justice for the victims of Russia's aggression in Mariupol and elsewhere. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra Turquía.
Mr. President, we thank Madam High Commissioner for the oral update. Turkey take notes of Madam High Commissioner's oral update with deep concern, and from the very beginning, we have shocked by the magnitude of loss of human lives and destruction of the city. Russia's military attack against Ukraine is unacceptable and is a grave violation of international law. In the meantime, we are trying to facilitate the negotiations process between our two neighbors. We want peace, but it should be a just peace for Ukraine. Within our facilitation efforts, we did our utmost to assist evacuations from Mariupol. Unfortunately, negotiations lost momentum after tragic events in Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities. This could lead to a protracted war, more bloodshed, more destruction, more loss of Ukrainian lives, more violations of human rights and humanitarian law. We will also have negative impact of global level. We are all feeling the negative consequences of the war. The impending food crisis is worrying. Turkey supports the UN plan to export Ukrainian grain through Black Sea, which requires cooperation between Ukraine and Russia. We are ready to host a meeting in Istanbul to discuss technical details of the UN plan. Thank you very much.
Teşekkürler. Tiene la palabra Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for the important update. Georgia remains deeply concerned with Russia's premeditated, unjustified and unprovoked full-scale aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a grave violation of international law and has prompted one of the fastest-growing humanitarian crises in recent history. Particularly shocking is the incredible violence imposed on the people of Mariupol, targeted bombing of civilians and civilian objects, killings, rapes, torture committed by the Russian armed forces are war crimes and require accountability. Georgia notes with appreciation the United Nations and the ICRC's joint efforts, which made it possible to evacuate hundreds of civilians, including children and elderly, from the Azovstal steel plant and other areas. We reiterate our call on Russia to comply with the provisional measures of the ICJ of 16 March, which binds Russia to immediately suspend military operations and withdraw all its forces and armaments from the whole territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and provide international human rights and humanitarian institutions with unhindered, immediate and safe access to persons transferred from the conflict-affected areas of Ukraine and held on the territory of the Russian Federation or areas controlled or occupied by the Russian Federation. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate Georgia's unwavering support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Malta.
Mr. President, Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union, and we thank the High Commissioner for her oral update on the tragic and unacceptable situation in Mariupol. These shocking events again illustrate the tragedy and severe impact on the enjoyment of all human rights by the unprovoked Russian aggression on the residents of Mariupol, as well as other cities and regions of Ukraine, whose everyday lives and possessions have been disrupted or lost due to the Russian advance. Malta shares the High Commissioner's views expressed in an earlier statement that Mariupol's residents have suffered unimaginable horrors. We also express our grave concern on the well-being of those who survived the onslaught. Reports of sexual violence on women and girls are deplorable, and we encourage the Commission of Inquiry to fully investigate these and all other alleged violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in line with its mandate. Accountability must be ensured. The repercussions on the survivors of Mariupol will accompany them for the rest of their lives. The damaging social, health, educational and psychological impact, particularly on children, will be a devastating legacy of Russia's actions in Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Argentina.
Señor Presidente, estamos consternados por los informes de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada que dan cuenta que Mariupol y sus habitantes han vivido una auténtica tragedia desde que comenzó el ataque armado de la Federación de Rusia. Nos hacemos eco de la alta comisionada cuando se alarma por la magnitud de la destrucción y las numerosas violaciones del derecho internacional, de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario que se han cometido en la ciudad, incluidos los ataques contra civiles y bienes de carácter civil. Lamentamos profundamente que una ciudad que alguna vez fue floreciente se encuentre ahora en ruinas y que el número de muertes de civiles se cuente por miles. Deseamos agradecer los esfuerzos conjuntos del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja y de las Naciones Unidas para la evacuación de civiles, incluidos niñas, niños, adolescentes y personas mayores. Instamos nuevamente a todas las partes en el conflicto a que respeten el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los refugiados, en particular los principios de distinción de civiles, proporcionalidad y necesidad del ataque. Les solicitamos igualmente que investiguen todas las denuncias de violaciones y garanticen una reparación adecuada a las víctimas. Las instamos también a cooperar plenamente con los mecanismos de este Consejo, incluyendo la Comisión de Investigación, permitiendo el acceso sin restricciones a todas las zonas afectadas de Ucrania. Reiteramos a la Federación de Rusia que cese inmediatamente en el uso de la fuerza y condenamos enérgicamente la invasión a Ucrania, a la vez que reafirmamos nuestro más firme compromiso con su soberanía, independencia política, integridad territorial y unidad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Mónaco.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. La Principauté de Monaco réitère son attachement sans faille à la souveraineté, à l'indépendance et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine et tient ici à témoigner une fois de plus sa solidarité avec le peuple ukrainien. Depuis le début du conflit, la population civile paie un lourd tribut en raison de violations inacceptables des règles du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. À cet égard, la Principauté de Monaco est extrêmement préoccupée par les allégations de graves violations des droits de l'homme à Mariupol, comme dans le reste de l'Ukraine, y compris les meurtres de civils, les violences sexuelles, les actes de torture et les disparitions forcées. Dans la ville de Mariupol, aujourd'hui presque entièrement détruite, bâtiments et infrastructures civiles, y compris écoles et hôpitaux, n'ont pas été épargnés. Si, comme dans le reste de l'Ukraine, il est impossible à ce stade d'établir un bilan précis du nombre de victimes, nous nous attendons malheureusement à ce que celui-ci s'élève à des milliers de personnes. En dernier lieu, ma délégation tient à exprimer ses plus vives inquiétudes quant aux conséquences de ce conflit sur la sécurité alimentaire mondiale. La Principauté en appelle donc à une levée immédiate du blocus des ports de la mer Noire afin de permettre la reprise des exportations des céréales ukrainiennes. Il en va de la santé et tout simplement de la survie de millions de personnes de par le monde. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Finlandia. Embajador.
Aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her oral update. Finland reiterates its strong condemnation of Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine. Our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity remains firm. Mariupol and its residents have suffered from brutal destruction and systematic violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law since Russia's war of aggression started. These violations may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Persons in vulnerable situations have been disproportionately affected. Residents of Mariupol are in a grave humanitarian crisis. The risk of a cholera outbreak is high. Russia is responsible for its continuing atrocities. Perpetrators for the most serious international crimes must be brought to justice. Finland fully supports the Commission of Inquiry, the investigation by the ICC, and the work of the OHCHR monitoring mission. Madam High Commissioner, what are your recommendations to ensure free and safe access for those delivering humanitarian assistance to Mariupol? I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra la embajadora de Croacia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. Croatia thanks the High Commissioner for her update and welcomes this occasion to address the situation in the heroic city of Mariupol that has turned into the symbol of the most poignant aspects of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and its people. The siege of Mariupol, its fall into the hands of the invaders, and the brave resistance of the defenders of Azovstal steel mill reminds us of the tragic destiny of Croatia's hero city of Vukovar in autumn '91. Croatia understands the importance of the fight against impunity. We know how traumatic it is for victims to wait for justice and for perpetrators to be convicted for the atrocities they committed. That is why grave violations of the international humanitarian and human rights law in Mariupol call for an independent investigation. Croatia pays tribute to the city's victims with dignity and respect. We urge Russia to release all prisoners, military or civilian, that were transferred out of the city. We call for assurance of decent life conditions, sufficient hygiene and public health standards, as well as provision of food and medical care to the population remaining in the city. Recent news of a possible cholera outbreak is especially worrying. We appeal to Russia, the occupying power, to respect the principles of international humanitarian law and to ensure normal life conditions to Mariupol residents. We urge Russia to undertake all possible efforts to reverse the recent death penalty sentences for captured foreign citizens. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. For almost 4 months, Russia has been waging an illegal war against Ukraine. We are horrified by Russia's onslaught on Mariupol, which has led to a wide-scale destruction of the city, including atrocities against the civilian population. The Russian attack on a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol, which left young children and women in labor buried beneath the rubble of destroyed buildings, was just one of many examples of abhorrent violations of IHRL and IHL committed by Russia. Furthermore, thousands of the city's inhabitants have been deported to Russia or forcibly displaced to the non-governmental controlled areas of Ukraine. We call on Russia, and indeed on all sides, to treat the wounded and sick as well as prisoners of war in full conformity with their obligations under IHL. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war are also spilling over across the globe. Russia's actions are disrupting agricultural production, pushing people into poverty, with the worst effects being felt in developing countries across Africa, Asia and the Middle East, where they increase the risk of hunger and famine. Despite Russia's disinformation campaign and attempts to put the blame on others, it is clear that Russia alone is responsible for this food crisis. These atrocities, war crimes and violations of the most fundamental rules and principles of international law must be and will be punished to hold those responsible to account. We fully support the independent investigations by the Commission of Inquiry and the prosecutor of the ICC. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Irlanda.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU, and we thank the High Commissioner for her update. Russia's military aggression against Ukraine has had grave human rights and humanitarian consequences, including in Mariupol. Ireland condemns the actions of the Russian Federation, including weeks of deliberate shelling, blockades on the delivery of humanitarian aid, as well as denying civilians the possibility to leave for safer areas in Ukraine. We remain concerned by the lasting impacts of the siege of Mariupol, including limited access to even the most basic services and goods, including water, electricity and medicines. Forcible transfers, including of children, from Mariupol to Russia are extremely worrying. We urge the immediate release and safe return of persons forcibly transferred and remind the Russian Federation of their obligations under the Geneva Conventions. Ireland is concerned by reports of sexual and gender-based violence against civilians, as well as confinement, mistreatment and disappearances of civilians. Impunity for any violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law should not and must not be tolerated. We commend the bravery of victims willing to come forward with their testimonies. The international community must follow this bravery and continue to stand firm against Russia's aggression. Madam High Commissioner, how can the international community best support the civilian population of Mariupol and ensure those forcibly transferred to another country are safely returned? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra United Kingdom.
Signor Presidente, hospitals, schools, theatres reduced to rubble, mass graves, illegal abductions, torture, sexual violence, women, children, the elderly left sheltering in bunkers, deprived of food, of water and medicine. That is the brutal reality of Putin's war, a total regard for human rights, international humanitarian law and the principles of the Charter. These war crimes must be investigated and those responsible held to account. Madam High Commissioner, we fully share your concerns on the death penalty sentences opposed against Aidan Aslin, Sean Pinner and Brahim Sadoun. All prisoners of war must be treated in accordance with international humanitarian law. And once again, we call on Russia to respect international law. The UK has led efforts to refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, and we will make every effort to assist that investigation, and we will work with international partners, including through the EU, US, UK Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and assist Ukraine's domestic investigation. Mr. President, we will continue to stand by the Ukrainian people in their hour of need. We have already committed £3 billion of humanitarian aid and economic assistance and military assistance. Madam High Commissioner, what more can the international community do to support civilians bearing the brunt of Russia's aggression in Mariupol and other areas currently under Russian control?
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Polonia. Embajador.
Senor Presidente, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. The name of the city of Mariupol has become a tragic symbol of the ongoing brutal Russian aggression against Ukraine. The long and intensive attacks on the city, resulting in widespread destruction of the residential areas and the dire living conditions of inhabitants, represent an extreme case of total disregard for human lives demonstrated by the invaders. The aggressor's premeditation has been confirmed further by deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure, including the maternity hospital and the theatre in Mariupol, killing hundreds of persons, including many children, who sought shelter there. We are extremely concerned about the situation of Ukrainians from Mariupol and other territories currently under Russian occupation, who are subjected to forcible deportation to Russia and placed in filtration camps. Mariupol is not the only place in Ukraine whose name will forever recall heroism of its defenders, dire fate of Ukrainian civilians, and horrific atrocities committed by the Russian invaders. The terrible findings in Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, and other Ukrainian localities after the withdrawal of Russian forces cry for justice and punishment for perpetrators. Poland firmly calls for accountability for violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including those amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We fully support all mechanisms, including the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council, mandated to gather evidence of the committed violations with a view to bringing the perpetrators to justice. Finally, we reiterate our calls to Russia to withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine in its internationally recognized borders and to fully respect the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, as well as international humanitarian law and human rights law in general. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra Bulgaria, Embajador.
Estimado Presidente, Bulgaria aligns with the statement by the European Union. We thank the High Commissioner for her update and welcome this important opportunity to make an assessment of the nature and causes of the appalling violations and abuses of human rights and the violations of international humanitarian law committed in the city of Mariupol. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest terms of Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, accompanied by gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law. Bulgaria is deeply concerned about the grave human rights abuses and the dire humanitarian situation in the city of Mariupol, as well as in other Ukrainian towns and villages. We are horrified by and condemn the reported atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces. The attacks against the civilian population, the loss of lives and the destruction of residential and civilian infrastructure should be investigated and prosecuted. Furthermore, we call on Russia to fully respect the rights and the dignity of the prisoners of war and to treat them in accordance with the requirements of international humanitarian law. Bulgaria has been consistently supporting the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and stands firmly behind the Ukrainian people. We call on Russia to comply in good faith with its obligations under international humanitarian law and to unconditionally withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine as defined by Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Moreover, we categorically reject Russia's ongoing attempts to consolidate and legitimize its control over the temporarily occupied territories in the southern and eastern Ukraine. Gracias, Presidente.
De nada. Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra la República Árabe Siria.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. بداية نؤكد على أن توفير معلومات نزيهة وموضوعية بشأن الأوضاع في الدول ركن أساسي لقيام مكتب المفوض السامي بعمله وفق الولاية المحددة له، بما يؤدي إلى تقييم موضوعي متوازن قائم على الحقائق، وبما ينأى به عن المعايير المزدوجة وحملات التشهير السياسي التي تقوض مصداقيته والدور المأمول منه. من هنا نأسف للنهج المتحيز الذي أظهره مكتب المفوض السامي حتى الآن في تقييم الأوضاع الحالية في أوكرانيا، وانتقائيته في عرض المعلومات وتبنيه مصادر أحادية لها، في الوقت الذي يتجاهل فيه المعلومات التي يقوم الاتحاد الروسي بتزويده بها بصورة دورية حول الأوضاع في دونباس ومناطق أخرى، إضافة إلى تجاهله حقيقة استمرار إغراق أوكرانيا بالسلاح والمرتزقة من قبل العديد من الدول الغربية، وهذا ما يترافق مع حملات تحريض وخطابات كراهية تعكس رغبة هذه الدول بتصعيد الأزمة وتعقد سبل الوصول إلى حل سلمي. نأمل أن يراجع مكتب المفوض السامي هذا النهج وأن يرفض محاولات بعض الدول توجيه عمله لخدمة أهداف هذه الدول السياسية الخاصة. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
شكرا. Tiene la palabra United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner. The United States is appalled by the atrocities and abuses committed by Russia's forces in Mariupol and throughout Ukraine. Russia's assault on Mariupol has led to thousands of civilian deaths. The evidence is clear. Its strikes have destroyed a maternity hospital, a theater, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, and its bombing of a safe corridor prevented critical humanitarian supplies from reaching Mariupol. The actions demonstrate brutality, callousness, and wanton disregard for the immeasurable human toll of Russia's unprovoked war. We will continue to support the documentation of conflict-related human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law, including war crimes, committed by Russian forces and their proxies. We note with great respect the accountability efforts of OHCHR's monitoring mission and the newly established Commission of Inquiry, and commend the war crimes units of Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General, which we support through the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. How can we ensure accountability in places where Russia has denied access to independent human rights monitors so that full accountability, for example, for Mariupol or the next potential Mariupol, will take place? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la embajadora de México. Micrófono, por favor, embajadora.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos a la alta comisionada su actualización oral. México observa con preocupación las trágicas consecuencias de la invasión a Ucrania sufridas por la población civil, particularmente en zonas de intensos enfrentamientos como la actual ciudad de Mariupol y en especial por personas en situación de vulnerabilidad. La información disponible evidencia un claro componente de género en las consecuencias del conflicto, el aumento de casos de violencia sexual hacia mujeres y niñas, así como el incremento en el riesgo de ser víctimas de trata, incluyendo con fines de explotación sexual, es altamente preocupante. Es fundamental que estos crímenes no queden impunes, que se lleven a cabo las investigaciones correspondientes y los perpetradores sean enjuiciados. Como se ha manifestado en otros foros, México está atento a la investigación en curso de la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania, establecida por este Consejo. Consideramos que el sistema de las Naciones Unidas debe trabajar de manera coordinada y seguir recabando evidencia sobre violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario y de derechos humanos en este conflicto. México insta a todas las partes del conflicto a que se produzca un cese inmediato al fuego que permita que esta tragedia, que implica serias violaciones a los derechos humanos de la población civil, termine. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Muchas gracias, embajadora. And now I give the floor to the Ambassador of New Zealand. Ambassador.
Mr. President, New Zealand thanks the High Commissioner for her oral update. The reports emerging of human rights abuses in Mariupol, including what you have outlined in your update, are appalling. We are alarmed by accounts of Russian troops committing atrocities against civilians in Mariupol as well as elsewhere in Ukraine. This includes verified reports of extrajudicial killings, forced relocation, and conflict-related sexual violence. We are deeply concerned by recent reports that the death sentence has been handed down against Ukrainian prisoners of war from Mariupol. The verified number of civilian casualties continues to grow, and we know the actual numbers are far higher. Mr. President, these horrific human rights violations and abuses must stop. The High Commissioner's update speaks to a disregard for innocent lives and includes credible evidence of crimes against humanity and war crimes. New Zealand supports efforts to hold those responsible for human rights violations and abuses to account. The extreme humanitarian crisis in Ukraine caused by Russia's invasion is disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups, including women, children, and persons with disabilities. We urge Russia to allow humanitarian corridors to Mariupol and other parts of Ukraine. Madam High Commissioner, what more could the international community do to strengthen accountability for human rights abuses in Mariupol and elsewhere in Ukraine and prevent the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine worsening? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Eslovaquia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovakia fully aligns itself with the statement of the European Union as well as with the statement presented by Albania on behalf of the group of states. We thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your update. We were not expecting any positive news. Sadly, but realistically, there are none. Where arms rose, human rights suffer. All this has been confirmed also yesterday by the Commission of Inquiry. There is an open war out there. A P5 member, nuclear power, Russia, is unlawfully attacking a smaller sovereign country, Ukraine. We heard from you, Madam High Commissioner, and from the Commission of Inquiry that there are documented cases of more serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and there are more to be disclosed and confirmed. We've heard also about possible fatigue with Ukraine file, and indeed Slovakia is tired. From ongoing aggression, from ongoing human rights violations, and complete ignorance by Russia of its international law obligations. I think we all agree that we must speak up and act where human rights are violated until justice is served. To conclude, we note that except the Commission of Inquiry, there are several actors who investigate and document crimes that have been committed on Ukrainian soil following the Russian aggression since 24 February. Slovakia, for example, is participating on the work of the joint investigation team together with ICC, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. Madam High Commissioner, what would be your message and advice to investigative teams operating in Ukraine? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra el embajador de Uruguay.
Señor Presidente, Uruguay agradece a la alta comisionada por su informe sobre la situación en Mariupol derivada de la agresión de la Federación Rusa. Extendemos nuestra solidaridad a los residentes, víctimas y familiares ante las graves pérdidas humanas y violaciones a sus derechos fundamentales. Uruguay reitera su condena a la invasión y su apoyo a la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania. Coincidimos en la relevancia de la rendición de cuentas para que todas las denuncias de presuntas graves violaciones a los derechos humanos sean debidamente investigadas por mecanismos internacionales. En tal sentido, Reiteramos nuestro respaldo a la Oficina y a la Comisión de Investigación, alentando a todas las partes a cooperar con estos mandatos. Nos interpela la constatación de la Oficina de que la mayoría de las bajas civiles fueran causadas por ataques a zonas pobladas, mediante uso de armas explosivas de amplio impacto, ataques aéreos y de misiles, constituyendo una flagrante violación del derecho internacional humanitario. Reiteramos nuestro llamado a que la negociación constituya la única vía para alcanzar una paz sostenible. Igualmente, urgimos que se garantice el acceso humanitario a todas las regiones de Ucrania, inclusive Mariupol, así como a la evacuación segura de los civiles que se encuentran en las zonas afectadas por el conflicto. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Gracias, embajador. Agora tem a palavra a delegação do Brasil.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. During the 34th special session of the Human Rights Council, Brazil expressed its deep concern about reports of increasing human rights violations in Ukraine, including in cities such as Bucha and Mariupol. We continue to closely monitor the situation as it evolves on the ground. We remain concerned about allegations of grave and systematic human rights violations, such as mass executions, sexual violence, human trafficking, and discrimination against refugees. Specifically in Mariupol, reports of massive civilian casualties, the systematic destruction of civilian buildings, and the dire humanitarian conditions of the population cannot go without proper verification by this Council. Brazil has taken note of the Commission of Inquiry's preliminary observations on Ukraine, based on its first visit to the country, and reaffirms its support for comprehensive, objective, and impartial investigations. We urge all parties to cooperate with the Commission and provide it with access and information to carry out appropriate investigations. We will remain vigilant to the situation on the ground in the hope that, through dialogue and negotiation, the parties involved will cease hostilities and prioritize the protections of human rights of all people in Ukraine. Muchas gracias.
Obrigado. Tiene la palabra Chipre.
With the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. As we approach 4 months from the start of Russia's illegal military invasion of Ukraine, the world continues to witness the resulting flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Redrawing national borders by military force can never be tolerated. Cyprus will keep on echoing our solidarity to Ukraine and our support to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We will keep on calling on Russia to immediately cease its military operations and withdraw its troops. We are shocked by the extensive destruction of areas of Ukraine, including the devastation of Mariupol in the hands of Russia and the ever-increasing loss of civilian lives. We remain deeply concerned by the humanitarian situation in Mariupol and are troubled by reports of mass forcible transfers. Civilians who choose to leave Mariupol must be provided with safe passage. At the same time, we condemn any type of demographic engineering. We are alarmed by the dire state of medical care and assistance and availability of medical equipment and medicine in Mariupol and reiterate that unhindered corridors must be established to facilitate humanitarian aid deliveries. Crimes must not be left unpunished. Cyprus fully supports the initiatives aiming at holding Russia to account so that we can deliver justice for the citizens of Mariupol and the Ukrainian people. I thank you.
Thank you. Última delegación de Estados tiene la palabra Irán.
Thank you, Mr. President. Iran deplores all wars and abhors military conflicts, regardless of their locations. The geopolitical roots of these crises and the concerns of its main parties should not be ignored. Iran is ready to play its role for the peaceful settlement of dispute between the two parties. Meanwhile, we request all parties to be mindful of and fully respect international humanitarian law. Mr. President, The international community should encourage and support the political and peaceful means, direct negotiation between Russia and Ukraine until peace is restored, the escalation of tensions, and urgent and lasting solution to ongoing conflict and crisis through dialogue and political means should be the heart of all efforts. Military confrontations have always been utilized by those who seek opportunities for arms sale and therefore further escalating and expanding the conflicts. My delegation reiterates on the peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and well-established principles of the United Nations Charter. We once again emphasize that the work of the Council shall be guided in a non-confrontational and non-politicized manner and by the principles of impartiality, non-selectivity, and constructive international dialogue and cooperation. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Y ahora vamos a pasar a la lista de ONGs e instituciones nacionales. En primer lugar, tiene la palabra Baptist World Alliance. Por video.
Madam President, the atrocities committed in Mariupol, Ukraine define customary international rules of armed conflict. The extensive, wanton destruction of property, the deportation of residents out of Ukraine via filtration camps, and attacks on undefended houses of worship are of great concern. The 5 houses of worship related to the Evangelical Baptist Union of Ukraine in Mariupol have all been damaged or destroyed in a pattern of extensive, wanton destruction. 90% of the people related to these houses of worship have fled. Those who were unable to flee, about 100 people, struggle with lack of water, food, and sanitary conditions. Some were able to escape early and found relative safety outside of the war zone. Church leaders report that still others were forcefully relocated to Russia. Their phones were checked, and photos and videos were deleted while in filtration camps. Monitoring of communication restricts those who have been deported from freely expressing where they are. Those who are able to connect with family back in Ukraine are able to say only, "I am alive." We call for the protection of civilians and civilian property, including houses of worship. Further, we call for the protection of refugees and internally displaced people. We call for humanitarian aid, including access to safe drinking water and sanitation for those still in Mariupol. Thank you.
Thank you. World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organization by video. No tenemos sonido. Pasamos a International Bar Association. No, perdón, International Federation for Human Rights Leagues. Y después volvemos a la anterior.
Mr. President, FIDH would like to draw the Council's particular attention to the situation of Ukrainians who have been forcibly displaced to Russia from Russia-occupied territories of Ukraine, including Mariupol. According to FIDH member organization in Ukraine, the Center for Civil Liberties, over 1 million people have been displaced to Russia since the reinvasion of Ukraine as of the end of May. Many of the displaced are compelled to go through so-called filtration camps in Russia-occupied territories. The filtration process can last up to 30 days and is often accompanied by interrogations, searches, sometimes beatings, and even torture. Those who pass the filtration process might be transferred to Russia and released, but for the most part, they cannot leave Russia. Those that don't are detained locally or sent to pretrial detention facilities in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Taganrog, and other Russian cities, where charges are being fabricated against them as we speak for later use in show trials. Forced deportation and these accompanying acts can constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. FIDH calls on Russia to urgently cease hostilities and withdraw its army from the occupied territories of Ukraine and to ensure the immediate and safe return of forcefully displaced Ukrainians. FIDH also calls on UN member states, including members of the Human Rights Council, to remain seized of the situation with a view to ensuring criminal accountability and other efforts to guarantee the implementation of the victim's right to truth, justice, and reparation. I thank you.
Thank you. Ahora sí, International Bar Association.
Thank you. The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute is extremely alarmed at the situation in Mariupol. As Mariupol is under Russian occupation, access to information about the real situation of people is limited. However, satellite imagery analysis have uncovered the rapid and massive expansion of cemeteries and mass graves since March 2022. In March, Russian forces' airstrikes at the regional drama theatre resulted in close to 600 civilian fatalities, despite the fact that the building was clearly marked as housing civilians, including children. In April, reportedly, Russian forces forcibly transferred the 40,000 Mariupol residents to Russia. A very recent independent legal analysis clearly demonstrates that Russia is breaching the Genocide Convention, emphasizing the serious risk of genocide in Ukraine, including Russia's incitement to commit genocide. These warnings cannot be ignored and should trigger states' duty to prevent under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. We call on the international community to support Ukraine and refugee host countries with humanitarian and other kind of assistance needed, and coordinate on legal avenues for justice, for accountability and reparation, including an ad hoc tribunal for the crime of aggressions. Thank you.
Thank you. Human Rights House Foundation.
Thank you. The atrocities carried out by the Russian forces in Ukraine include executions of civilians and journalists, enforced disappearances, forcible transfers of large numbers of civilians from Ukraine to Russia, including deportation of children and family separation, widespread use of torture, and sexual and gender-based violence. Our Ukrainian partners particularly highlight the thousands of Ukrainians being held in Russian filtration camps and the reports of appalling treatment and conditions. We also highlight the case of Yulia Payevska, a civilian paramedic who was taken hostage with her driver Sergei while conducting an evacuation near Mariupol on 16th of March. She was later seen on Russian TV with visible signs of ill treatment. We call on her swift and safe return. President, the Commission of Inquiry is mandated to establish the root causes of violations and abuses in Ukraine. We and others have long been documenting the erosion of human rights within Russia. There is now a stranglehold on civil society which has enabled the Russian authorities to act with near impunity abroad, including the most recent unprovoked attack on Ukraine. President, we must already look to the next stage of the accountability process, even as the COI carries out its work. We ask the High Commissioner how an international tribunal could be established to prosecute certain international crimes that are documented by the COI. Thank you.
Thank you. Center for Global Non-Killing. Tiene la palabra.
Dear human beings, Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, greetings of peace and understanding. My heart cries. Be it on the graves and ruins of Mariupol or here in the high audience of the Human Rights Council, the right to life and the non-killing principle shall always be upheld. Human rights are fundamental rights, rooted in the best and shared parts of our human nature, needed for our societies to thrive and prosper, needed for the well-being and happiness of each and all. Only happy people will breed a happy and sustainable war. Along these fundamental rights, we need fundamental methods. War is not one of them. To name a few: education, inclusivity, development goals, consensus, peaceful settlement of disputes universally, value-enhanced procedures. Peace and the right to peace are links between all people, a link needed to fulfill all human rights. Now is the time, if ever, to reopen the discussion on the right to peace and to loudly proclaim that Ukrainians and Russians alike, as all human beings, have the right to live in peace. Please stop the war. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Comisión Internacional de Juristas.
Mr. President, the Russian Federation's illegal invasion of Ukraine, an act of aggression constituting a crime under international law, has led to a human rights crisis that is particularly grave in Russian-occupied Mariupol. Following extensive destruction of infrastructure and large-scale civilian killings in the city, thousands of bodies have been buried in spontaneous burial places or remain unburied, and water supplies are contaminated. The failure to ensure essential sanitation, safe drinking water, and healthcare leaves an estimated 100,000 inhabitants at serious risk of disease. This violates the Russian Federation's international law obligations to guarantee the rights of water, sanitation, health, and housing, as well as its obligations as an occupying power under IHL. This situation follows the Russian siege of the city with indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and attacks targeting civilian objects, including destruction of medical facilities and killing of medical personnel in violation of IHL. Attacks against Mariupol Maternity and Children's Hospital and the Mariupol Drama Theater, where civilians, including children, had taken refuge, have been identified by the OSCE Moscow Mechanism report as a clear violation of IHL and war crimes. Coordinated international efforts are needed to ensure the collection of evidence and the independent investigation of these crimes in Mariupol and throughout Ukraine so that those responsible are brought to justice. I thank you.
Thank you. Human Rights Watch tiene la palabra.
Thank you, President. Russian forces' assault on Mariupol relied on attacks and tactics that resulted in indiscriminate and disproportionate civilian suffering and loss of life. It is imperative that Russian forces be held accountable for unlawful attacks and other serious violations of international humanitarian law in the city. Documenting all such instances will take time, given the sheer number of strikes that took place. Access to and preservation of evidence, given Russia's occupation of the city, will be the most significant challenge to documentation. The international community should make all efforts to help preserve evidence and enable meaningful investigations and justice for serious violations. President, some civilians who wanted to flee Mariupol were forcibly transferred to Russia or Russia-occupied areas of Ukraine. Human Rights Watch interviewed individuals who were desperate to find safety and wanted to go to Ukraine-controlled territory. However, many had, or were made to feel they had, no choice but to go to Russia or Russia-occupied areas. Along the way, Russia-backed armed groups and Russian security agents subjected Ukrainian citizens to a screening process known as filtration. That involves searching their bodies, belongings and phones, and questioning them about their political views and contacts. Russian authorities detained those they deemed affiliated with Ukrainian forces. Russian authorities should guarantee that Ukrainian citizens transferred to Russia have unfettered access to legal, civil society and other support services that may assist them in relocating inside or outside Russia as they wish. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra por video Asociación hasteoir.org.
War is often the failure of diplomacy and peace, and, convinced that there is hope, we advocate for this war to end. In a war, many thousands are killed, starved, left in poverty, forced to displace, as well as the tragic separation from family and loved ones. The initial reasons matter little when it becomes a them and us dynamic, a dynamic in which everyone loses. Material damages can be repaired over time, but unfortunately personal scars can take years, decades, or even generations to heal. Regaining trust between neighbors who have been fighting to death is never easy. In these conditions, respect for the rules of war, international humanitarian law and human rights is more necessary than ever. There is no doubt that possible violations of international humanitarian law and human rights must be investigated and the perpetrators tried and sentenced appropriately. From the Citizen Go group, we have promoted alerts and campaigns that, sustained by prayers, called for an immediate end to the war, an end to the hostilities, and a respect for the dignity of each and every person. If we had consideration for the human person in its full dignity and of its full fundamental rights, most of the alleged atrocities and war crimes would never happen. We believe that there is hope. We trust those who have the possibility to put an end to this war. Would the countries involved and the international community prove that peace and the cessation of this conflict is possible? Thank you, President.
Thank you. Y último orador, World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organization. Por video.
Mariupol, once beautiful, free and developing city, after months of heavy shelling, was completely destroyed by Russian forces. There, the Russian army committed unspeakable atrocities and war crimes, including massive killing of Ukrainians, causing serious bodily and mental harm, destroying civilian infrastructure and inflicting conditions incompatible with life, forcible deportations of thousands of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation, and rapes to prevent birth. Genocidal intention and acts are obvious. Civilians who managed to survive are lacking access to clean drinking water and risking infectious disease outbreaks such as cholera. Similar to other territories temporarily occupied by Russian forces, reports about denial of basic human rights, looting of civilian property, grain and metal products on a mass scale, attack on Ukrainian culture, education and destruction of Ukrainian books are overwhelming. Azov regiment that resisted the brutal slaughter of Ukrainians in Mariupol was subject of massive disinformation campaign by the Russian Federation, which started long before the full-scale attack on Ukraine. Now we still have important concerns over the fate of more than 2,500 soldiers from Mariupol who are in Russian captivity. Our organization, in the name of families of Ukrainian soldiers and all Ukrainians, call to mobilize international efforts to improve their conditions and help them return safely to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Ahora sí, este fue el último orador de la lista. Le damos la palabra a la alta comisionada para sus observaciones finales.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies and friends, colleagues, thank you very much for the important intervention by member state and civil society organizations. I will try to address some of the questions. Concerning questions around the issue of accountability and access to Mariupol that many countries and NGOs have mentioned, as I mentioned in my statement, my office does not have access to the territories under control of the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, including Mariupol itself. However, we are able to monitor and document the situation according to our established methodology, including by speaking directly with people who left the city and communicating remotely with people who remain in the city. All violations documented and verified through different sources will be on record and, as appropriate, will be reported publicly, as well as also shared with established accountability mechanism through a coordination and direct cooperation. All information provided, including that referred to by the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, has been transmitted to relevant colleagues for assessment. I stress the utmost importance of the insistence by the Council and the international community for international monitors, including OHCHR staff, to have full access in all relevant areas in Ukraine, including Mariupol and other areas controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. This would enable my office most readily to verify allegations taking place there. As you know, the international community has already taken a series of active steps in terms of accountability, both within and outside the UN system. OHCHR also notes the efforts of the governments of Ukraine to investigate and prosecute war crimes. 3 Russian servicemen have already been sentenced for war crimes for respectively the killing of a civilian and indiscriminate shelling of populated areas. The international community should continue to advocate for accountability at all levels within both civilian and military structures at the national level, as well as continue to explore and support regional and international mechanisms. National level accountability is the point of departure and must be supported by all concerned, but where there is an unavailable or insufficient, regional and international mechanisms are also appropriate to ensure there is no impunity gap. The ICC's investigation, in coordination with other actors, is central to this process. The ability of the Ukrainian authorities to fairly, effectively and independently investigate, prosecute and try alleged international crimes committed on its territory must also be supported and strengthened. My own office continues its work documenting violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and I expect the result of the Commission of Inquiry to also broaden the analysis and assessment of relevant information. Documentation is critical to ensure accountability for all violations committed. To guarantee the independent and impartial monitoring of our mission, we ask the international community to stress to all sides the critical importance of OHCHR's work in Ukraine and to advocate for complete and unimpeded access for our human rights officers to all areas in Ukraine. Given the many initiatives, I urge every effort by various investigative teams to effectively coordinate work, emphasizing the need to avoid duplication in efforts to support investigations, avoiding re-traumatization of victims, survivors, and their families, while taking full account of protection considerations. For our part, my office, including the HRMIU, is operationally coordinating with both the Commission of Inquiry mandated by this Council, as well as with the Office of the ICC Prosecutor, in order that, within respective mandates, methodologies, and capacities, we can collectively act to best and add effective investigative value across the many areas of concern across the country, and with the principle of doing no harm to victims and families. Concerning the question on the rights of minority groups, we are in contact with our interlocutors from national minorities. OHCHR is aware of reports of individual instances of people of African descent having faced discrimination and obstacles during evacuation and crossing the border in February-March to escape from areas affected by the Russian armed attack on Ukraine. However, we have not documented a broader pattern of discrimination. In Mariupol, we have not documented a pattern of discrimination in that sense, which suggests that ethnic and other minorities suffer similarly from hostilities and indiscriminate shelling as other members of the local community in Mariupol. However, I note that Mariupol and some villages around the city are home to a small and unique group of Azov Greeks, Romans, and Hurums. As a result of hostilities and forced resettlement, these groups have been dispersed and are at higher risk of accelerated assimilation and weakening of identity. I also note that at least one mosque was damaged by shelling during the hostility, and 2 synagogues were completely destroyed. As there is no access to OHCHR staff, no independent media, and human rights defenders working with minorities have left or are hesitant to speak out, the situation of minorities in Mariupol is yet to be fully assessed. Concerning the questions of many of you on prisoners of war, this is an issue of great concern for us. There are many credible reports about the abuse of the prisoners of war on every side. With regard to Mariupol, more than 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been taken as prisoners of war from the city since early March. OHCHR received allegations of the killing of 1 Ukrainian soldier in Mariupol or the combat, and ill treatment of several others. In the absence of access to prisoners of war in territory controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, OHCHR has not been able to assess their numbers, condition of detention, and treatment. Similarly, OHCHR has not been able to determine the number of gravely wounded prisoners of war which, under international humanitarian law, must be repatriated. OHCHR has, however, interviewed Ukrainian servicemen captured in Mariupol in early April and in turn in Donetsk region and later in the Russian Federation. They told OHCHR that they were heavily beaten by the guards in the Russian Federation and threatened with sexual violence. To ensure the protection of persons deprived of their liberty by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, it is critical that independent monitors, including from international organizations, have unfettered access to all places of detention. OHCHR also notes that since the armed attack of the Russian Federation, law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, in particular the SBU and National Police, have arrested more than 300 individuals suspected of crimes against national security, including espionage, state treason, and artillery spotting, among others. OHCHR has observed that in some cases law enforcement agencies concealed their detentions. Suspects were taken away without providing any information to their relatives about the reasons for arrest, detaining authorities, and further fate of their relatives. OHCHR has documented 12 cases of enforced disappearance by Ukrainian law enforcement of people suspected of providing support to Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, among which 10 victims were either later released or confirmed as detained. OHCHR calls on the government to cease all such practices and detain and prosecute alleged perpetrators only in line with international due process and fair trial standards, which are not subject to derogation even in the time of war. With regard to the question about interned people, the number of people who fled Mariupol territory controlled by Russian-affiliated armed groups of the Russian Federation and were subsequently interned remains unclear. OHCHR is concerned about the manner in which the so-called filtration is carried out on civilians living in areas of ongoing or recent hostility through territory controlled by Russian armed forces or affiliated armed groups. OHCHR does not have sufficient information to assess the general situation of those who fail to pass the filtration assessment, but it has documented several cases of individuals detained after the procedure on unclear grounds. OHCHR has been seeking access to individuals who were detained after failing to pass filtration and to those who reportedly passed filtration but were still detained and further held in a center for evacuees in Besimene. As of 15th of May, OHCHR had not been granted access to these individuals. Concerning the question of forcible transfer, the exact number of people relocated from Mariupol to territory controlled by Russian-affiliated armed groups of the Russian Federation remains unclear. Although relocated people seem to enjoy a relative freedom of movements once in the Russian Federation, OHCHR is concerned that people without any alternative, with no financial means to travel to the border, or who have lost or been deprived of personal identification documents are not able to fully exercise their freedom of movement or the right to return. Close attention must be paid to this issue, with responsibility on the states in which they are found to permit full freedom of movement. Concerning the question on support to civilians, the international community should continue to call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. While hostilities continue, the international community should call on the parties to, first, fully comply with international humanitarian law in the conduct of hostility. Second, it should urge parties to agree on safe humanitarian corridors for the voluntary evacuation of civilians and for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Assistance should address the needs for women, men, girls and boys in vulnerable situations and from different marginalized groups. Special attention should be paid to specific requirements of older persons and persons with disabilities. The international community can also support national institutions, local civil society networks, and other relevant actors in government-controlled territory by providing resources and strengthening their capacity to work with survivors of arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, sexual violence, torture and ill treatment, and to provide them with non-discriminatory, comprehensive services, particularly in smaller towns and rural areas early controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. However, support should always be provided with the highest level of a do-not-harm approach. The human cost of the protracted fighting for control of Mariupol has been beyond price. Just the most obvious lesson that this war, as all others, is a repudiation of human rights at their most basic level have yet to be learned, and the same patterns of destruction are repeating themselves as we debate, notably in Severodonetsk. How many more discussions, named for one destroyed city after the other, must this Council hold? I appeal once more to the Russian Federation to cease its military operation in Ukraine and to resolve all differences it may have with Ukraine through peaceful means. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Esto nos lleva al final del diálogo interactivo. Quiero darle las gracias a la alta comisionada por su participación. Deberíamos haber procedido ahora con la presentación del informe del secretario general sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en la República Islámica de Irán, en cumplimiento de la resolución 76/178 de la Asamblea General. Sin embargo, he sido informado que el informe aún no ha sido procesado. En consecuencia de la presentación del informe, se pospondrá una etapa posterior y los mantendremos informados sobre la fecha y la hora en que tendrá lugar. Llegamos al final de esta presentación y vamos a escuchar, antes de pasar al siguiente punto, las declaraciones en ejercicio de derecho a réplica bajo el punto 2, y hay una delegación que ha solicitado la palabra. Tiene 3 minutos la delegación de Nicaragua.
Gracias, señor presidente. La delegación de Nicaragua quiere ejercer su derecho a réplica sobre las declaraciones de Estados Unidos durante el reporte anual de la alta comisionada. Nicaragua rechaza las declaraciones hechas por Estados Unidos y les recuerda que no tiene derecho de hablar de violaciones de derechos humanos en otros países, estando su historia plagada de violaciones a los derechos humanos. invasiones y financiamiento de guerras en otros países, como está bien documentado. Hay que recordar las violaciones sistemáticas de derechos humanos a las minorías, a los afrodescendientes, a los niños, la violencia policial sistemática que existe, la violencia de armas, la implementación de medidas unilaterales coercitivas a países, violentándoles a los derechos más fundamentales a las poblaciones de los países. Nicaragua, como miembro de las Naciones Unidas, cree firmemente en la paz y sobre todo salvaguarda la autodeterminación de los pueblos y defiende su soberanía. Hacemos un llamado nuevamente a la no politización y parcialización del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y a volver a establecer un diálogo y cooperación constructiva entre las partes. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna otra delegación desea hacer uso del derecho a réplica? Veo que no. Haremos una pequeña pausa técnica antes de continuar con el diálogo interactivo con el experto independiente sobre la protección contra la violencia y la discriminación basada en la orientación sexual y la identidad de género bajo el ítem 2.